Every day, the clock struck 10, and the streets of Harlem held their collective breath. It was a city within a city, a sprawling metropolis of brownstones and jazz halls where the official currency of the United States was often secondary to a different kind of paper. In the 1920s, while the rest of the nation looked toward Wall Street and the surging tickers of the New York Stock Exchange, a shadow economy was being built on the doorsteps of the working class. It was known as the numbers. It was a game of chance, a lottery for the disenfranchised. But beneath the surface, it was a sophisticated financial engine that moved millions of dollars through the hands of those the banks refused to serve. The mechanism was deceptively simple. For a single penny, a nickel, or a dime, a player could choose a 3-digit sequence. The odds of winning were a staggering 1 in 1,000, yet the promise of a 600-to-1 payout offered a glimmer of hope in a world defined by systemic poverty. But a game this massive required more than just luck. It required a mastermind. Someone who understood that in a world of chaos, math was the only true authority. Enter Casper Holstein. He did not look like a criminal kingpin. He did not carry himself like the street-level thugs who would eventually try to claim his empire. He was a man of quiet dignity, a Virgin Islander who had served in the Navy and studied the intricacies of the commodities market. He watched the way the wealthy moved their money, and he realized that the same principles of liquidity and risk management could be applied to the streets of Harlem. Holstein did not just run a gambling ring, he created a financial institution. He understood that the greatest weakness of any illegal lottery was the integrity of the winning number. If the kingpins chose the numbers themselves, the people would eventually stop playing. Trust was the only thing that kept the capital flowing. To solve this, Holstein turned to the most public, most untouchable data available, the daily figures of the New York clearinghouse. Every day, the newspapers published the totals of the bank clearances. By taking the digits from these massive, federally monitored financial reports, Holstein ensured that no one could accuse the house of cheating. The very institutions that barred black citizens from opening accounts were now, ironically, providing the mathematical foundation for their underground economy. By the mid-1920s, Holstein was the Bolito king. He was reportedly worth millions, a staggering sum at a time when a loaf of bread cost pennies. But he was not a hoarder of wealth. He became Harlem's greatest philanthropist, building dormitories for students, funding the Harlem Renaissance, and ensuring that the profits of the numbers stayed within the community. He was the unofficial central banker of a neighborhood that the rest of the country had forgotten. But wealth of this magnitude, especially wealth held by a man of color in a segregated America, could not remain invisible forever. As the numbers grew into a multi-million-dollar industry, it caught the attention of two very different and very dangerous entities. The first was the law, but the second was far more predatory. Down in Lower Manhattan, the white organized crime syndicates were watching. They saw a massive pool of untapped capital flowing through Harlem, and they decided they wanted all of it. The era of the gentleman banker was about to end, and the era of the machine gun was about to begin. The piece was held together by a fragile thread of influence, but that thread was beginning to fray. Holstein knew the math of the game, but he was about to learn the math of power. In the shadows of the Prohibition era, a new kind of predator was sharpening its teeth, and they weren't interested in playing by the rules of the New York clearinghouse. The first strike would not come from a courtroom, but from the darkness of a rainy New York night, and it would change the face of Harlem's economy forever. The year was 1928, and the atmosphere in Harlem was thickening with a premonition of violence. Casper Holstein had built a fortress of capital, a financial ecosystem that thrived in the gaps left by a segregated banking system. To the residents of the upper Manhattan streets, he was a savior in a tailored suit, a man who funded literary prizes for the Harlem Renaissance and built dormitories for those the state ignored. But to the Italian and Jewish mobs downtown, Holstein was something else entirely. He was a market inefficiency that needed to be corrected. The numbers racket was no longer a neighborhood game. It had become a high-volume financial instrument, generating tens of thousands of dollars every single day. In the era of Prohibition, where the flow of illegal alcohol was the primary source of liquid wealth, the numbers represented a different kind of prize. It was clean, it was consistent, and it didn't require a fleet of trucks or a network of bootleggers. It only required a pencil, a piece of paper, and the trust of the community. The first crack in Holstein's empire didn't come from a rival's gun, but from a kidnapping. On a humid night in September, when as Holstein walked toward his home, a black sedan pulled alongside him. Men posing as police officers forced him into the vehicle at gunpoint. For 3 days, the king of Harlem disappeared. The ransom demand was $50,000, a fortune in 1928, equivalent to nearly $1 million today. Holstein paid the price for his freedom, but in the eyes of the underworld, the aura of invincibility had been shattered. The message was clear. The streets of Harlem were open for business, and Casper Holstein's peace was over. As Holstein retreated into a more cautious, philanthropic life, a power vacuum began to form. Into this void stepped a woman of fierce intellect and even fiercer reputation, Stephanie St. Clair, known to the streets as Queenie. She was an immigrant from the French West Indies who spoke multiple languages and possessed a refined sense of style. But underneath the elegance was a tactical mind that rivaled any CEO on Wall Street. She took the reins of the numbers, organizing the various banks of Harlem into a unified front. She knew that the downtown mobs were coming, and she knew that the only way to survive was to outthink them. The threat arrived in the form of Arthur Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz. Schultz was a man of visceral brutality who saw the numbers as his next hostile takeover. He didn't want a partnership. He wanted total vertical integration. He began by intimidating the local collectors, the runners who moved the slips of paper from the doorsteps to the counting houses. If a runner refused to work for Schultz, they were beaten. If a policy bank refused to pay him a tax, it was firebombed. Schultz brought a new kind of math to Harlem, the math of the industrialist. He realized that the decentralized nature of the numbers was its greatest strength, but also its greatest weakness. By consolidating the banks under his own control, he could manipulate the payouts, fix the numbers, and drain the community's wealth back into his own pockets. He was a corporate raider with a Tommy gun. Queenie St. Clair did not back down. She took out full-page advertisements in the local newspapers, calling out the corruption of the NYPD and the encroachment of the downtown mobs. She was fighting a war on two fronts, against the law that protected the white mobs and against the mobs themselves. The tension in Harlem reached a breaking point. The streets became a chessboard where every move was punctuated by gunfire. But as the conflict escalated, a much larger shadow was beginning to fall over the entire American economy. The year was 1929, and the numbers on the New York Stock Exchange were about to do something that no one, not even the Bolito King, could have predicted. The year was 1929, and the numbers that had once signaled prosperity were beginning to bleed. On Wall Street, the ticker tape could not keep up with the frantic pace of the sell orders. The Great Depression did not just shatter the fortunes of the industrial titans. It rippled through the tenements of Harlem with a devastating clarity. As the official economy collapsed, the underground economy of the numbers became, for many, the only remaining safety net. When the banks closed their doors, the policy banks stayed open. But this resilience made the numbers an even more attractive target for Dutch Schultz. With his bootlegging profits drying up due to the impending end of Prohibition, Schultz moved to colonize Harlem's financial landscape with the cold efficiency of a corporate raider. He wasn't just collecting a tax anymore. He was seizing the infrastructure. He used his political connections to ensure that NYPD raids targeted only the independent black-run banks, leaving his own operations untouched. It was a classic monopoly play, enforced by the badge and the bullet. Stephanie St. Clair, the queen of strategy, found herself backed into a corner. She had spent years building a system based on community trust, but Schultz was playing a different game. He didn't care about trust. He cared about volume. He began to manipulate the winning numbers by bribing the clerks who handled the bank clearance figures. The mathematical purity that Casper Holstein had established, the very soul of the game, was being corrupted. The house was no longer just a statistical favorite. It was a predator. The tension reached a fever pitch as St. Clair took the fight to the press, publicly accusing the authorities of being on Schultz's payroll. Her defiance was legendary, but the sheer weight of the mob's resources was beginning to crush the local operators. One by one, the independent banks folded or sold out to the Dutchmen. The capital that had once stayed in Harlem to build schools and clinics was now being funneled into the coffers of a man who viewed the neighborhood as nothing more than a harvest. As the 1930s dawned, the conflict shifted from a battle for territory to a battle for survival. Schultz was at the height of his power, but his arrogance was creating enemies in high places. A young, ambitious prosecutor named Thomas Dewey was beginning to build a case against the mob, and the numbers racket was the centerpiece of his investigation. Schultz, feeling the walls close in, proposed a solution that horrified even his most hardened associates. He wanted to assassinate the special prosecutor. This was the breaking point. The syndicate, the board of directors for organized crime, knew that killing a high-ranking official would bring the full weight of the federal government down upon them. They had a choice to make: protect one of their own or protect the business. Behind the closed doors of a Newark steakhouse, the decision was reached. The Dutchman was no longer an asset. He was a liability. The end came in a hail of lead in a men's room, leaving a vacuum of power that the entire city was scrambling to fill. But as Schultz lay dying, a final message was sent to Stephanie St. Clair. The war was over, but the victory would be hollow. The numbers were no longer a community-owned secret. They had been exposed to the light of the law, And the state had realized something that the mob had known all along. There is no greater tax than the one people pay voluntarily. The echoes of the gunshots in a Newark tavern marked the end of an era, but the system Dutch Schultz had corrupted did not die with him. As the smoke cleared, the numbers racket transitioned from a street-level struggle into a permanent fixture of the American urban landscape. Stephanie St. Clair, having survived the Dutchman and the treacherous politics of the 1930s, eventually retired from the game, passing her remaining influence to her lieutenant, Bumpy Johnson. But the true victor was not a person. It was the state. The investigation led by Thomas Dewey and the subsequent crackdown by the FBI dismantled the traditional policy banks. Yet the hunger for the game remained. The authorities realized that they could never truly stop the numbers, because the game was built on a fundamental human desire for a way out of a rigged financial system. Decades later, the very mechanism Casper Holstein had pioneered, a daily, public drawing based on randomized numbers, would be legalized, sanitized, and rebranded. The neighborhood policy bank was replaced by the state-run lottery. The transition was a masterclass in financial co-option. What was once an informal banking system that kept capital circulating within the black community became a multi-billion-dollar revenue stream for the government. The high-end suits of the 1920s kingpins were replaced by the bureaucratic efficiency of state commissions. The math remained the same, but the beneficiary had changed. The wealth that Holstein used to build dormitories and fund poets was now absorbed into general funds, often failing to return to the neighborhoods that provided the capital. Casper Holstein died in 1944, relatively poor compared to the millions that had once flowed through his hands. He was a man who understood the velocity of money before the term was common in textbooks. He saw that for those locked out of the marble halls of Wall Street, a 3-digit slip was more than a bet. It was a microloan, a savings account, and a dream of autonomy. Today, we see the descendants of the numbers in every corner of our digital economy, from the high-frequency trading algorithms that hunt for patterns in market data, to the explosive growth of online gambling and predatory lending. The spirit of the racket lives on. We are still a society obsessed with the hit, the 1 in 1,000 chance to bypass a system that feels increasingly weighted against the individual. The story of the numbers is not just a tale of gangsters and gambling. It is a story of how capital finds a way to move, even through the cracks of a broken society. It teaches us that where there is a lack of institutional trust, an underground economy will always rise to fill the void. Holstein and St. Clair were the architects of a shadow Wall Street, proving that even in the darkest corners of history, the numbers never lie. To understand the future of money, we must first understand its past. Subscribe to uncover the truth.